The rancher turned down every woman, until an Apache widow asked, "You want a wife or just shelter?" John Miller was a man shaped by the land he worked. His ranch, a wide stretch of sun-baked plains and rolling hills in New Mexico, had been his home for as long as he could remember. The land had taught him patience, resilience, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing the fruits of your labor grow under your own hands. From sunrise to sunset, John's life followed a rhythm dictated by the needs of his animals, the seasons, and the unforgiving weather. He woke early, long before the sun touched the horizon, and began his day by checking on his herd of cattle. He knew each cow by name, remembered their quirks, and understood their moods better than he understood most people. The animals depended on him, and he took pride in being the one who ensured they were safe and healthy. Despite the demanding work, John's life had a certain simplicity. His home was a modest wooden cabin with a stone fireplace sturdy enough to withstand the harsh winters and hot enough to take the chill off the spring nights. There was no electricity beyond a single lantern in the main room, and his possessions were few but functional. Everything in his life had a purpose. Tools were well kept, furniture sturdy, and the little garden he tended provided just enough vegetables to add flavor to his meals. John enjoyed the order and quiet of his life. There were no interruptions, no unnecessary drama, and no complications beyond those brought by nature itself. Yet beneath the surface, there was a loneliness that John rarely admitted, even to himself. He had loved once, many years ago, and the memory of that heartbreak still lingered. Since then, he had turned away every woman who tried to enter his life. Some were gentle and kind, some flirted with charm, and some seemed determined to persuade him otherwise, but John always said no. He valued independence and feared that letting someone in would change the careful balance he had built. His heart, he believed, had learned enough pain to last a lifetime, and he would not risk it again. Even with his solitary existence, John's neighbors respected him. He was known as a man of integrity, a person who would lend a hand when needed but never asked for help unnecessarily. He had earned his reputation through years of hard work, honesty, and fair dealings. People in the nearby town spoke of him with admiration, though many whispered about the man who had never married, who turned down every offer of companionship, and who preferred the company of his cattle over human conversation. John didn't mind the gossip. It rarely reached him, and it mattered little to him. His world was defined by the land, the animals, and the routines that brought order to his days. Morning after morning, John went through the same rituals. He fed the horses, mended fences, checked the water troughs, and ensured the cattle were healthy and calm. He moved with a quiet efficiency, performing each task with care and attention. To an outsider, it might have seemed monotonous, but for John, it was life itself. The rhythm of labor brought a kind of peace, and the satisfaction of a job well done filled the empty spaces that loneliness sometimes crept into. Still, there were evenings when the silence pressed against him more heavily. After a long day, he would sit by the fire with a cup of coffee, watching the embers glow and listening to the wind rustle through the grass. In those moments, memories of laughter, warmth, and shared life would visit him briefly. He would remember holding someone's hand under the stars, the gentle voice of a partner calling from the cabin, and the feeling of being understood without words. But these memories were fleeting, and John would push them aside, telling himself that his life was full in its own way, that he didn't need anyone else to complete it. John's neighbors occasionally tried to intervene, offering advice or encouragement. Women from town would send letters or sometimes visit, hoping to soften his resolve. But John's answers were always polite and firm. He would thank them, compliment their kindness, but ultimately decline. Some left disappointed, others frustrated, and a few simply laughed at his stubbornness. John didn't mind their reactions. He believed that a life chosen carefully and lived honestly was far better than one dictated by fleeting emotions or the pressures of society. The land itself seemed to mirror John's solitude. Endless skies stretched above the plains, painted with the deep oranges and reds of sunrise and sunset. The wind whispered through the grasses and sagebrush, carrying the scent of earth and dry timber. At times the sky would open in a storm, sending rain and thunder across the fields, and John would face it with the same stoic determination he applied to every challenge. Nature demanded respect, and John had long ago learned to meet those demands with hard work and unwavering focus. Despite the isolation, John's life was never dull. He faced problems that required patience, creativity, and courage. A sick cow needed careful attention. A fence might collapse in a storm, or predators could threaten the herd. Each day brought new challenges, and John met them all with a calm confidence born of experience. The land and the animals rewarded him in return, and the balance of give and take kept him grounded. Evenings were his quietest hours. After tending to the animals and finishing the day's work, John would return to his cabin. He would light the fireplace, tend to the small garden, and prepare a simple meal. He enjoyed the solitude, the opportunity to reflect on the day, and the comfort of knowing that his labor had been meaningful. And yet, as much as he valued these moments, there was always a shadow, a quiet longing for connection that he could not entirely deny. The truth was, John's heart had not hardened entirely. Deep down, he wondered what it would be like to share his life, to have someone sit across from him at the dinner table, to hear laughter echo through the cabin, and to feel the warmth of another human being beside him. But fear and caution kept him from seeking it. Past disappointments had taught him that love could hurt, and he preferred the safety of solitude to the uncertainty of companionship. And so John continued his days moving through the land with quiet strength and unwavering resolve. He tended to his cattle, repaired his fences, and walked the fields with the measured steps of a man who knew his place in the world. His life was simple, honest, and defined by routine. Yet beneath the surface, there was a tension between desire and restraint, between the comfort of isolation and the faint whisper of longing. John's story at this point was one of quiet endurance, a man who had built a life on his own terms, who had turned away love to protect himself, and who had found contentment in work and routine. But life has a way of changing even the most steadfast hearts, and the winds of the plains often carry surprises in their currents. John's days of solitude, however peaceful, were about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test everything he believed about life, love, and the possibility of opening his heart again. In the golden light of another morning, John rose as usual, checking on the herd and walking the fields. He did not know that his life was about to be interrupted in a way he could not have anticipated. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a new presence was moving closer, one that would challenge his solitude and force him to confront the very question he had spent years avoiding. Could he allow someone else into his carefully guarded world? As the wind blew across the plains and the cattle grazed quietly, John remained unaware of the change approaching. The day would begin like any other, yet it carried the seeds of something new. In his cabin, the fire crackled softly, the coffee steamed in his cup, and the plains stretched endlessly before him. And for the first time in many years, the stillness of John's life hinted that it might not last forever. John's morning routine was just beginning when he noticed something unusual on the horizon. The sun had barely risen, painting the plains with soft shades of gold and orange, when a small, slow-moving wagon appeared in the distance. At first, John thought it was a traveling merchant or perhaps someone seeking work on the ranch, but as the wagon drew closer, he realized it was different. The wheels were worn, the canvas covering was patched in several places, and there was a quiet dignity about the figure guiding it that made him stop mid-step. The woman driving the wagon was tall and strong, with skin bronzed by the sun and eyes that held a calm, piercing intelligence. Her presence was commanding, yet there was a gentle determination in the way she moved and spoke to the children who sat quietly beside her. John watched from a distance, leaning against the fence as she guided the horses carefully, adjusting the harnesses with practiced hands. She seemed familiar with hardship, with the way the world could demand everything from a person, and yet she carried herself with pride. When she reached the edge of John's property, the wagon stopped and the woman stepped down. Her children followed her, shy but attentive, looking at John with wide, curious eyes. She walked toward him, boots stirring up small clouds of dust, and stopped a few feet away, hands on her hips. She studied him for a long moment, and he felt an unexpected unease. There was something in her gaze that seemed to see through him, past the walls he had built around his heart, straight to the part of him that still longed for connection. "I need a place to stay," she said finally, her voice steady and calm. There was no pleading in her tone, only a clear statement of fact. "My name is Lila. I'm a widow, and these are my children. I can work, I can help, but we have nowhere else to go." John studied her carefully. He had seen many travelers in his time, some looking for work, others for charity, and some simply lost. But there was a difference in Lila. She didn't ask for help with hesitation or embarrassment. She demanded no pity. Her eyes were honest, and her posture unyielding. There was a quiet strength about her that both impressed and unsettled him. "I don't usually take in strangers," John said, keeping his voice neutral. He didn't want to seem unkind, but he also didn't want to commit to anything. "The land is my responsibility, and it's not easy work." "I'm not here for a free stay," Lila replied without hesitation. "I can cook, clean, help with the cattle, repair fences, anything you need. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for shelter, and maybe for a place where my children can be safe." John shifted, uncertain how to respond. He had never faced someone like this before, someone so forthright and confident. Most women who had come into his life tried to charm him, to soften him with words and gestures. But Lila did not try to charm him. She asked for what she needed, clearly, without hesitation, without fear. And for some reason, that made him uneasy. He glanced at the children who were now standing a few feet behind her. They were quiet, but their eyes were bright and alert. He could see that they had experienced hardship, that life had not been easy for them, and yet there was a spark of resilience there that mirrored their mother's strength. John felt a pang of sympathy, though he immediately turned his attention back to Lila. He reminded himself that he had spent years alone, and that opening his home to strangers could bring complications he was not ready for. Lila noticed his hesitation. She tilted her head slightly, a small, knowing smile appearing at the corners of her lips. "You want a wife? Or just shelter?" she asked, her voice even, but with an edge of challenge. John froze, caught off guard. The question was so direct, so unexpected, that he wasn't sure how to respond. Most women never spoke to him this way. They either flattered, begged, or avoided the subject entirely. But Lila had put it plainly, and in that moment, John realized something he hadn't admitted to himself in years. He was curious. He wanted to know more about her. He wanted to see what she could do, how she thought, and what kind of life she could build alongside his own. I I don't know, he said finally, keeping his voice steady. He was aware of the unusual sound of uncertainty in his own words, a rarity for a man who had always relied on certainty and routine. Lila laughed softly, a sound that was warm but confident. Then we'll see, she said simply. I don't expect promises, and I don't expect handouts. I expect work, honesty, and respect. That's all. Over the next few hours, John watched her closely as she and her children set up camp at the edge of the ranch. She worked efficiently, unloading supplies, arranging tents, and guiding the children to help where they could. It was clear that she was capable, self-reliant, and determined. There was no hesitation in her movements, no complaining about the labor or the long day. So John felt a mix of admiration and unease. He had spent so long alone, so accustomed to managing everything himself, that the thought of another person, especially someone so strong-willed, entering his life was almost frightening. By evening, Lila had prepared a simple meal for herself and her children. The aroma of cooked vegetables and fresh bread drifted toward John's cabin, drawing him from his usual solitude. He stepped outside, leaning against the doorway, watching them eat. Lila caught his gaze and nodded politely, a silent acknowledgement of his presence. For a moment they simply looked at each other, two solitary figures assessing the possibility of connection. Days passed, and Lila proved herself to be more than just capable. She helped with the cattle, repaired fences that had fallen in storms, and even took on tasks John had long handled alone, easing his burden in ways he had not realized he needed. The children were quick learners, respectful of the land and eager to help their mother. John found himself observing them from a distance, a strange mix of caution and curiosity growing within him. One afternoon, as they worked together repairing a broken fence, Lila spoke softly, her voice carrying over the clatter of tools. "This land is tough," she said, "but it will reward you if you respect it. You've done well here, John. The way you care for it, it shows." John paused, surprised that she knew his name. "You've been watching," he said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I've been learning," she replied simply. "I like to understand the place I am in before I judge it. And I don't judge easily." There was something in her words that unsettled him, not because they were critical, but because they were true. She spoke with honesty and clarity, qualities that John valued deeply, yet had rarely encountered in anyone else. For the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of a connection that was neither fleeting nor shallow. Evenings became a time of quiet observation and reflection. John would sit on the porch of his cabin, watching Lila and her children move about the ranch, their lives intertwined with the land in a way that mirrored his own connection. He noticed how she moved with confidence, how her hands were strong but gentle, and how her children mirrored her resilience. He felt a growing respect for her, mixed with a cautious hope that perhaps life could be shared without losing the independence he cherished. Yet John remained cautious. He had built his life around solitude, and he knew that opening his heart too quickly could lead to complications, misunderstandings, or heartbreak. He reminded himself constantly that he had survived alone for many years, that his routines were reliable and that the land depended on him. The thought of letting someone else in was both exhilarating and terrifying, and so a delicate balance formed. Lila and her children became part of the ranch, helping and learning, while John observed, guided, and guarded his heart. There was no rush, no expectation beyond the practical work that needed to be done. But beneath the surface, something quietly shifted. a recognition that life, even in its simplest form, could hold new possibilities if one had the courage to embrace them. By the end of the week, John realized that the quiet tension he had felt was transforming into something else. He was no longer simply observing Lila, he was thinking about her, wondering how she would handle challenges and noticing the ways she brought life and energy to the ranch. The question she had asked on that first day, "You want a wife or just shelter?" lingered in his mind, challenging his long-held beliefs and stirring emotions he had carefully set aside. The plains stretched wide and empty around them, yet for the first time in many years, John felt that the space between him and another person might not be a barrier, but an opportunity. He had spent so long guarding his life, but Lila had arrived not with demands or fear, but with honesty, skill, and courage. And somehow, in the quiet rhythms of work, meals, and shared labor, she had begun to carve a place in his world, a place that was neither intrusive nor overwhelming, but welcomed. The sun set on the plains, casting a warm, golden glow across the ranch. John stood silently, watching Lila and her children move through the fields, their laughter faint but unmistakable. He felt something stir in his chest, a mix of curiosity, admiration, and something that approached hope. For the first time in years, he wondered what it would be like to share his life, to welcome another person fully into the rhythm of his days, and to see what might grow from this unexpected arrival. John's life had begun to shift in ways he hadn't expected. Leela and her children were no longer strangers at the edge of his ranch. They were becoming part of its rhythm, and their presence was slowly breaking down the barriers he had built around his heart. But as much as he admired Lila's strength and independence, he also noticed that their differences sometimes created tension, a friction that tested both of them. From early morning to late evening, John and Lila worked side by side on the ranch. They repaired fences, tended the cattle, and mended broken equipment. John had always been self-reliant, confident in his own methods, and meticulous about how things were done. Lila, while equally skilled, approached tasks with her own perspective. Sometimes her way was faster, more efficient. Other times it clashed with John's careful routines. At first, these differences led to brief arguments, silent frustrations, and moments of stubborn pride on both sides. One morning, while mending a fence that had been damaged by a recent storm, Lila suggested a different method for securing the posts. "If we tie them this way, they'll hold better through the wind," she said, demonstrating with practiced hands. John frowned, shaking his head. "I've always done it this way. It works." "I know it works," she replied gently. "But this way might last longer. You might want to try it." John hesitated. He wasn't used to taking advice, especially from someone who wasn't family. His pride, carefully cultivated over decades of solitude, bristled. But when he watched her method, he realized she was right. The fence felt stronger, more secure, and he could see the wisdom in her approach. "All right," he said finally, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "We'll do it your way." That small concession marked a turning point. John began to see that Lila's independence didn't threaten his way of life. It complemented it. Her knowledge, skills, and courage were assets, not challenges. And slowly, he began to let go of his rigid routines, learning to accept help, ideas, and even suggestions from someone other than himself. The children, too, became part of the ranch's rhythm. John watched them closely, noting how quickly they adapted to the work and how eager they were to learn. They followed Lila's guidance, but also observed John, learning the value of patience, focus, and respect for the land. Watching them, John felt a strange mixture of admiration and protectiveness. Their presence reminded him of the family he had never had, the warmth and connection that he had once pushed away. Yet, as the days passed, John also noticed the cultural differences between himself and Lila. She spoke of traditions and practices from her Apache heritage, stories of the land and the people who had lived there long before settlers arrived. John listened with interest, sometimes puzzled, sometimes amazed. He realized that the world she carried with her was different from his own, but it was not less valuable. Learning to understand her perspective required patience and humility, qualities he thought he had mastered, yet now found tested. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of pink and purple, Lila approached John with a question. "Do you ever feel lonely?" she asked quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them during chores. John looked at her, surprised. He had spent so long keeping his feelings private that no one had ever asked him directly. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I'm used to it. Solitude isn't all bad." "I can see that," Lila replied gently, "but sometimes solitude can hide what you really want. It can make you forget what life feels like when shared." Her words lingered in John's mind long after the sun had disappeared and the first stars appeared in the night sky. He realized that she was right. He had spent years guarding his heart, believing that independence was everything. But perhaps he had been avoiding not just pain, but also joy, connection, and the possibility of love. Their growing connection was not without its challenges. Lila had her own fears and grief, memories of her late husband, and the responsibility of raising her children alone. She was wary of trust, careful not to give too much too soon. John, too, had walls built from years of solitude and heartbreak. Both of them had been shaped by loss, and both carried scars that made vulnerability difficult. Yet, in their shared labor and quiet conversations, they began to find ways to bridge the gap between caution and trust. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the plains, dark clouds swallowing the sky. Rain fell in heavy sheets, and the wind whipped fiercely. John and Lila rushed to secure the animals and protect the small crops that had survived the season. They worked together seamlessly, communicating without words at times, understanding the urgency and the tasks that needed attention. In the chaos of the storm, they discovered a new level of partnership, a trust that was built not on words alone, but on shared action and mutual respect. After the storm passed, the sun returned, and a rainbow stretched across the horizon. John and Lila stood side by side, wet and tired, but smiling. "We make a good team," she said, nudging him lightly. "Yes," John replied, a warmth in his chest he hadn't expected. "We do." It was in these moments, amid the challenges and triumphs of daily life on the ranch, that John began to realize the depth of his feelings. He admired Lila's courage, respected her intelligence, and felt a growing affection for her strength and determination. He also recognized the joy that her children brought, their laughter and curiosity filling spaces in his life that he had long ignored. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. John would sit by the fire in his cabin, thinking about the day, about the work accomplished, and about the conversations he had shared with Lila. He noticed how much he looked forward to seeing her each morning, how he sought her opinion on small tasks, and how he began to anticipate her presence in ways he had never anticipated anyone else. Lila, too, was navigating her feelings. She had come to the ranch seeking shelter and safety, but she found herself drawn to John's steadiness, his quiet strength, and the integrity with which he lived his life. She admired his skill with the land, his patience with the animals, and the subtle kindness he showed, even when his words were few. Opening his eyes, she was cautious, aware of the walls he had built, but she also saw glimpses of the man he could be if he allowed himself to trust and care for someone beyond himself. Their relationship developed slowly, without rush or expectation. Work and survival dictated the rhythm of their days, but within that rhythm, moments of connection began to blossom. A shared meal, a quiet conversation by the fire, a helping hand during a difficult task, all became opportunities to learn about each other, to build trust, and to begin the delicate dance of partnership. John's neighbors began to notice the change as well. The man who had once been known for his solitary nature was now seen working alongside Lila, sharing laughter and cooperating in ways that had seemed impossible before. Whispers of curiosity and admiration spread through the small community. People began to see not just a man and a stranger, but a potential partnership, two lives gradually intertwining on the plains. Despite the growing bond, challenges remained. Differences in culture, upbringing, and experience required patience and understanding. Misunderstandings sometimes led to arguments or moments of tension, but each challenge also became an opportunity to grow, to communicate more clearly, and to strengthen the connection that was forming. One evening, as the wind whispered through the grass and the last light faded from the horizon, John realized that he was no longer the same man who had turned away every woman. He had begun to open his heart, to accept that companionship could coexist with independence, and that love did not require surrendering his identity. Lila had challenged him, inspired him, and quietly shown him the possibilities of a life shared without losing oneself. As the stars emerged in the clear night sky, John felt a sense of peace and anticipation. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that the arrival of Lila and her children had changed everything. Their presence had brought life, energy, and connection into a world that had once been defined by solitude and routine. And in that quiet moment, he realized that he was ready to embrace the unknown, to explore the bond that had begun to grow between them, and to discover the joy and strength of partnership. Spring arrived on the plains with a gentle warmth, bringing life back to the fields and a sense of renewal to John's ranch. After months of working together, John and Lila's relationship had grown into something deeper than companionship. They had shared hard labor, storms, and quiet evenings under the stars. Trust had begun to replace hesitation, and respect had turned into admiration. But despite the closeness that was developing between them, neither had spoken the words that would define their bond. Lila had transformed the ranch in small but meaningful ways. The gardens she had planted flourished, providing fresh vegetables and herbs that John had long neglected. She taught the children skills she had learned from her own upbringing, passing on knowledge of the land, storytelling, and practical lessons in independence and resilience. John watched as they absorbed her wisdom with wide-eyed curiosity, amazed at how quickly they adapted and grew under her guidance. One morning, John noticed Lila working in the garden, her hands deep in the soil, the sunlight highlighting her determined expression. She looked up and caught his gaze, a small smile touching her lips. He felt a warmth in his chest, a quiet recognition that her presence had become more than helpful. It was essential. The ranch felt fuller, more alive, and even the animals seemed to respond to her calm authority. John approached her slowly, careful not to interrupt her work. "You've done a lot here," he said, his voice low, almost unsure. "I don't know how I managed without you." Lila wiped her hands on her apron and laughed softly. "You managed, yes. But now you're learning that life is easier when it's shared. Even the land seems happier with a little extra care." Her words made John pause. He realized she was right. For years, he had prided himself on his independence, but he had never understood how much joy could come from partnership. Lila wasn't trying to take over his life. She was enhancing it, filling in the gaps he hadn't even noticed existed. The children ran past them, chasing a dog across the yard, their laughter carrying through the morning air. John watched them, feeling an unfamiliar sense of belonging. He had grown attached to them quickly, drawn to their energy, resilience, and the way they reminded him of what life could be beyond the solitary routines he had always followed. Lila noticed his expression and gave him a knowing look, one that suggested she understood exactly what he was feeling. As the days went on, the bond between John and Lila deepened. They shared small moments of intimacy, though often without words. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder, a shared glance across the yard, or a quiet conversation while tending the cattle conveyed feelings that neither dared to speak aloud. Both had been hurt in the past, both carried scars, and both were learning slowly how to trust again. One evening, after the day's work was done, John and Lila sat by the fire outside the cabin. The sky was painted in shades of purple and gold, and the first stars began to appear. The children were asleep, tucked safely in their makeshift tents, and the ranch was quiet except for the occasional call of a night bird or the rustling of the wind through the grass. "I've never had someone like you on this ranch," John said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was low, thoughtful, and carried a weight of sincerity that surprised even him. Lila turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "And I've never met someone like you," she replied softly. "You've built a life here that's strong, steady, and honest. It's remarkable." John felt a warmth spread through him at her words. Oh. For the first time in years, he felt seen, not just for what he could do, but for who he was. He realized that Lila didn't want to change him or control him, and she respected him, valued his work, and understood the life he had created. And in that understanding, he found a sense of comfort he had never known. Over the next few weeks, the two of them began to explore their relationship in more personal ways. They shared meals together, cooked side by side, and spent long hours talking about their dreams, fears, and the lives they had led before meeting. Lila spoke of her late husband, of the challenges she had faced as a widow, and of her hopes for her children. John listened, offering gentle support and quiet understanding, careful not to overstep, but eager to be there for her. One afternoon, while fixing a fence that had been damaged by a recent storm, John and Lila found themselves working closely together. Their hands brushed as they passed tools back and forth, and for a moment they both paused, aware of the electricity of the touch. Neither spoke immediately, but the moment lingered, heavy with unspoken feelings. Lila looked at John, her eyes searching his, and he felt his chest tighten. "John," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of hesitation, I'm glad we met. I didn't know life could feel like this again." John's heart beat faster, a mix of fear and hope coursing through him. He wanted to respond, to tell her everything he felt, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Me too," he said simply, the sincerity in his tone undeniable. The children, sensing the shift between their mother and John, began to spend more time helping on the ranch, eager to be part of the harmony forming between the two adults. They learned quickly, not just the practical skills of ranch life, but the subtle ways in which cooperation and respect built a home. Their laughter, energy, and curiosity filled the ranch with life, making it feel less like a solitary place and more like a true home. As the weeks turned into months, John and Lila faced challenges together. Weather, work, and the responsibilities of raising children tested their patience, communication, and problem-solving skills. But each challenge became an opportunity to strengthen their bond, to trust one another, and to prove that their partnership was more than convenience. It was a choice, a mutual commitment built on respect, love, and understanding. One evening, after a long day of repairing fences and tending to the cattle, John and Lila sat quietly on the porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. The sky was ablaze with color, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and earth. John felt a deep sense of peace, a rare contentment that came from knowing he was not alone in the work and in life. "Lila," he said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd feel like this again. But with you, I do. I feel whole." Lila reached out and took his hand, her touch firm but gentle. "I feel the same," she said softly. "We've both carried so much pain, but together we're stronger. We can face anything if we trust each other." John squeezed her hand, the simple gesture carrying a depth of emotion neither of them had expressed in words before. In that moment, the barriers they had built around their hearts began to crumble, replaced by a quiet, enduring love that had grown naturally through shared labor, trust, and respect. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had transformed into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and connection. The animals thrived under their care, the children flourished under Lila's guidance, and the land itself seemed to respond to the harmony of their efforts. John realized that he had not lost his independence by welcoming Lila into his life. Instead, he had gained companionship, partnership, and a renewed sense of purpose. Even the nights, once quiet and lonely, were now filled with the soft sounds of life. Lila's children slept peacefully, and John and Lila often stayed up talking by the fire, sharing stories, dreams, and the simple joys of being together. They learned to communicate without fear, to support one another, and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with opening one's heart. As spring turned to summer, John and Lila's bond continued to grow. They faced challenges together, celebrated successes, and built a life that was strong, resilient, and full of love. Their partnership was not built on romance alone, but on trust, respect, shared responsibility, and the quiet understanding that each brought out the best in the other. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, casting a warm glow over the ranch, John knew that life with Lila was no longer a possibility. It was reality. They had navigated the difficulties of blending two lives, two families, and two worlds, and had emerged stronger, united, and ready to face the future together. For John, the man who had once turned down every woman, the arrival of Lila and her children had opened a door he never thought he would walk through. And as he watched her move across the fields with the children by her side, he realized that love, respect, and partnership were not threats to his independence. They were the foundation of a life richer, fuller, and more meaningful than he had ever imagined. The ranch had changed with the seasons, but the most significant change was not in the land or the animals. It was in the people who lived there. John Miller, once a solitary man who had turned down every woman who came his way, now found himself living a life full of warmth, laughter, and shared responsibility. Lila, the Apache widow who had asked him that bold question months ago, "You want a wife, or just shelter?" had become the center of his world, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned her place through courage, skill, and honesty. Spring had given way to summer, and the ranch was thriving. The grass was tall and green, the cattle strong, and the crops abundant. Lila's garden had flourished beyond John's expectations, filling the cabin with fresh vegetables and herbs. The children ran through the fields, laughing and learning, their small hands skilled in the tasks of the land. They had grown close to John, trusting him and respecting him as much as they admired their mother. Watching them, John felt a sense of family he had never known before, a connection that went beyond routine or duty and touched something deep within his heart. Life together was not without its challenges, of course. There were storms that tore through the plains, repairs that demanded every ounce of energy, and days when the sun beat down relentlessly, testing endurance and patience. Yet John and Leela faced these trials side by side. Every obstacle became a lesson in trust and partnership. When a fence collapsed during a violent summer thunderstorm, they worked together tirelessly to rebuild it, their hands moving in unspoken coordination. When a sick calf needed care, Lila's knowledge of herbal remedies and John's experience in handling cattle made the task manageable through shared effort. They strengthened not only the ranch, but the bond between them. One evening, after a long day of work, John and Lila sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The children were asleep, and the ranch was quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle. The sky was a canvas of gold, pink, and purple, and the air was warm but gentle. John looked at Lila, her face glowing in the fading light, and realized how deeply he cared for her. It was no longer a fleeting admiration or cautious respect. It was love, solid and unshakable. "Lila," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. She turned to him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. I don't know how to say this exactly, but you've changed my life. You've made this place feel like home in ways I never imagined." Lila reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and steady. "You've always built this home," she said softly. "I just helped you see. It wasn't meant to be lived alone." John smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The walls he had built around himself over decades of solitude were falling away, replaced by something gentle, enduring, and true. "I want us to be a family," he said. "All of us, together, not just for the work, but for life. I want you, Lila, and your children to belong here with me." Lila's eyes shone with unshed tears, and she nodded, squeezing his hand. "I want that too," she whispered. "I've been cautious. I've been afraid. But I see now that we can build something strong, together." The days that followed were full of joy, laughter, and shared effort. John and Lila celebrated the small victories of ranch life. The first healthy calf of the season, a bountiful harvest, a fence rebuilt stronger than before. They also shared quiet, intimate moments, walking across the fields at sunrise, sharing meals under the shade of a tree, or simply sitting together by the fire at night, talking about dreams and plans for the future. The connection between them deepened with every day, every shared experience, every challenge overcome together. The children, too, were thriving. They had grown attached to John, seeing him not just as a helper or a neighbor, but as a father figure. He guided them with patience, teaching them the skills they would need to care for the land, the animals, and eventually themselves. Lila watched these interactions with a quiet pride, seeing how their bond with John brought stability and love into their lives. The laughter and energy of the children filled the ranch, transforming it from a simple working space into a true home. One afternoon, as John and Lila worked to repair a section of fence along the far edge of the property, they paused for a moment, leaning on their tools and looking out over the rolling hills. The wind blew gently, carrying the scent of grass and wild flowers, and the distant mountains shimmered in the afternoon sun. "We've come a long way," John said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "I never thought I'd see this. Our lives intertwined like this. It feels right." Lila smiled, her eyes soft but confident. "It is right," she said. "We've both carried so much pain, so many responsibilities, and yet here we are, stronger together than we ever were apart." John nodded, feeling the truth of her words. Their partnership was not born of convenience or necessity. It was born of respect, understanding, and love forged through shared experience. They had learned to rely on one another, to trust each other's instincts, and to face life's challenges together. And in that reliance and trust, they had discovered a joy and connection that neither had expected, but both had secretly hoped for. As the days passed, John and Lila began to dream of a future beyond the immediate needs of the ranch. They spoke quietly about long-term plans, expanding the gardens, improving the barn, and even considering a small home for the children where they could learn, play, and grow safely. They talked about the life they wanted to build, not just for themselves, but for the family they were creating together. One evening during a particularly spectacular sunset, John took Lila's hand and led her to the top of a small hill overlooking the ranch. The wind ruffled their hair, and the sky blazed with brilliant colors that seemed almost unreal. "Lila," he said, turning to face her, "I've spent so many years alone, afraid to let anyone in. But with you, I found something I didn't even know I was missing. I love you completely. I want to spend the rest of my life with you and the children, building this life together." Lila's eyes filled with tears of joy, and she pressed her forehead to his. "I love you too, John," she whispered. "And I'm ready to face life with you, to build this family, and to make this ranch truly ours." The seasons continued to turn, bringing new challenges and triumphs. Together, John and Lila faced storms, illness, and the ever-demanding work of the ranch. Each obstacle was met with cooperation and determination, strengthening their bond and deepening their love. Through it all, the children thrived, growing confident, resilient, and full of curiosity about the world around them. By late summer, the ranch had transformed completely. Where once there had been a solitary man working alone, there was now a family: John, Lila, and the children, living and working together in harmony. The land flourished, the animals thrived, and the cabin, once quiet and empty, now echoed with laughter, conversation, and the comfort of shared life. John often reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had once been content with solitude, certain that independence was all he needed. But the arrival of Lila and her children had shown him that life could be richer, fuller, and more meaningful when shared. Their partnership had not diminished his freedom, it had enhanced it, giving him purpose, joy, and a sense of belonging he had never imagined. Lila, too, reflected on the journey. She had arrived at the ranch seeking shelter and safety, uncertain what the future held. But she had found not only security, but love, respect, and a family built on trust and shared effort. John had taught her the rhythms of the ranch, the strength in routine, and the quiet satisfaction of steady work. In return, she had brought warmth, wisdom, and resilience to the land and its caretaker. Together, they had built a life neither could have achieved alone. As the sun set on another day, casting a golden glow across the fields, John and Lila stood together on the porch, watching the children play near the garden. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass, and the distant mountains shimmered in the evening light, John felt a profound sense of peace and gratitude. "This is home," he said softly, his hand resting on Lila's shoulder. "Yes," she replied, leaning against him. "This is where we belong." And so, life on the ranch continued, full of love, laughter, and shared purpose. John and Lila had discovered that true partnership required patience, trust, and courage, and they had embraced it fully.